So what we thought would be useful is for us to begin to kind of paint a bit of a picture in terms of the development of the City Circle and just the general kind of wider British Muslim community over the last 15 years. This was 1999 was a very long time ago. In the context, we're talking pre-social media, we are talking pre-7/7, we're talking pre-9/11. The kind of issues that we were tackling then are, well, some of them are different to what the issues we're tackling now, but some of them are quite familiar and similar. And it'd be interesting just to have that discussion of kind of the trajectory of the Muslim community over the last 15 years. The format of this evening, so we kicked off, and we're going to have a kind of panel discussion, but very interactive with the audience, from the original team here who set the organisation up in 1999. And we'll do that for about 20 minutes, and then I'm going to hand over to Rabia, who will then share a session with the current project managers and kind of the vision kind of going forward. And then there'll be kind of food and networking at the end. So if we kick off, so just on mine is Asim Siddiqui, so I'm one of the trustees, or still one of the trustees of the City Circle. On my right is Rashad Yaqub, who is one of the founder trustees, one of the kind of brainchild behind the organisation. So he'll be kind of describing some of the context of 1999. To my left is Maria Aramakku, again a former trustee and one of the founders organised. So we brought him back. She's like, no exceptions. Just come back. To again talk about some of the education reforms and welfare. So you can see this is going to be quite interactive. This is going to be pretty important. On my extreme left, literally on the extreme left as well, is Shahida Hoga. She was responsible for organising and launching Just Peace, which was a Muslim peace lobby group that came out of the City Circle and very much was part of getting Muslims involved in what was then known as the anti-war movement. And we can discuss how successful that was. So if we kick off with Rashad, just to paint a picture of what life was like, in 1999 and the kind of issues we were tackling then.
Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all. 1999. How do I describe the zeitgeist of 1999? Well, it wasn't quite East is East, which I'm sure everyone's familiar with, but there's certain themes which perhaps I can recall and illustrate, which may or may not actually be alive today. It'd be quite interesting to see from the range of people here actually what they think of the origins and the journey and the direction of City Circle, because I'm sure there probably won't be much in the way of consistency. And that's probably one of the defining features of the City Circle project, would be too organised a word. Perhaps adventure would be more apt. But there was a very strange, very elusive, very peculiar search for certainty in uncertainty. And I'll expand on that. Back in the day, in 1999, and my kids will love that expression, back in the day, it shows them how old that is. But back in the day, in 1999, there was a very strange phenomenon in terms of the concept of this Muslim community. You just graduated, you just basically had your options of Islamic branding. If you were cool and you basically a bit more streetwise and you knew which boutiques to get your designer gear from, you probably ended up in HT. If you basically were slightly more conservative and had probably chilled out a bit more in the early years of university and decided to get a much more certain feel for your Islamic journey, you probably ended up towards the Salafi sector. If you're kind of somewhere in the middle, but you were a nice guy, and you were kind of middle of the road, you probably experimented with young Muslims. But what was absolutely clear was on the campuses in 1999, there were a number of very clear, certain brands which are on offer, which you had to buy hook, line and sinker in order to be accepted into the Muslim fraternity. And I suppose the thing that really catalysed it for me was, and again, everyone's got their own sort of journey in terms of City Circle, was when I was faced with a very interesting human rights case involving a number of young British Muslims. And having seen their arrest, having seen their treatment, it was really sad, but actually the first time we went with a human rights case involving young Britons abroad, and the first generation of so-called Islamic terrorism was being born, the response of the Muslim community was completely absent. In fact, probably the only person, and I'm so glad that he's actually in the room today, that one of the Uncle G's, because I used to be young then, or one of our teachers from the older generation who actually agreed to join that human rights campaign was in fact Dr. Siddiqui, who's actually here today. And what was even more interesting for me was when I first met up with another person who's in the room today, a lawyer called Gareth Pearce, somebody who I came across through searching the Legal 500, somebody who actually I thought was probably was a bloke actually. The name, I'm sure you've heard that 70 times. But actually, when I met her, one of the first things that she said in her usual understated way was, first it was the Irish, and now it's the Muslims. And galvanising a team of young, articulate, professional people to take on a campaign of international sort of proportions. That's what really gave me a lot of the motivation in terms of forging something like City Circle together. Young, balanced professionals who could use their legal, their IT, their medicine, their research, and all those different sort of disciplines were needed to get behind campaigns which weren't necessarily Islamic, which didn't require just qualifying through various systems of tarbiyah, but actually were there to basically contribute and add value to the Muslim condition and the Muslim community in Britain, and even more importantly from, I think, our point of view, is to give something back to the wider British society. And that's where the concept of actually channeling your Islam towards actively contributing something to the wider British society practically, and therefore forging a better relationship between Muslims and non-Muslims. And I think looking at the composition 15 years on, I'm really quite proud, especially at the next generation who've taken City Circle to a totally different level, is to see that composition now. Back in the day, 15 years ago, there would have been a curtain put up in the middle, forcibly by the crowd, actually. I mean, it's been led by, there's been no formal membership, it's been led by the people who come. And people would self-regulate, people would put up, people would sit wherever they wanted and so on. People would be heckling if, somebody stood on the stage and their beard wasn't long enough. People weren't ready to accept the fact that, co-engagement in terms of Muslims and non-Muslims, it's no big deal now. All of those concepts, have come through a journey and have come through an element of randomness. But I think most importantly, and I'll end on this note, I think there's been a shared concept or shared vision that we haven't actually got all the answers. We haven't actually got a predefined script or predefined methodology that we can borrow or inherit from foreign organisations or even domestic organisations. We are on a very fascinating and interesting journey where we are making it up as we're going along. Yes, we're getting inspiration from our cultural and our religious and our spiritual roots, but we are admitting the fact, and we are conscious of the fact that on this journey we need many friends. On this journey we can take wisdom from any different container, and we are in need of alliances and strength where actions and good righteousness and the human search for justice is a shared concept. It's a shared concept not just from Muslims, but from non-Muslims. And if we can enrich British society with that search for justice and contribute by taking inspiration from our faith, then I think we can help to make Britain a better place. Thank you.
Keep developing some of the themes that Shahid was discussing. Speaking to Shahid, what is your view, from your perspective, in terms of, you look at just the theme of tolerance? Do you think the Muslim community and the younger Muslims are more tolerant now than they were 15 years ago, or less so?
At the risk of generalisation, I say yes, definitely. I think that
more tolerant. Or less?
More tolerant.
Okay.
I would think that as Rashad has said, the script has been redefined. You don't have to belong to Hizb ut-Tahrir, you don't have to belong to ISB or Muslims, etc. I think that there are more organisations that are serving as open platforms or forums where people can go and participate. And I think one of the things Rashad touched but I need to bring to the fore is the fact that women, especially I can speak from personal experience, City Circle was a welcoming open platform because as a woman I felt I stood on equal footing with men. I wasn't shunned into the sisters section and I wasn't told to go to sisters only events that were all about being a good Muslimah, etc., etc. I felt like I could deal with issues that were relevant to me and weren't gender specific. So in terms of that, I thought that that was also quite a momentous open space to find. And in terms of young British Muslims being more open, I think just in the run-up to my involvement with Just Peace or the Stop the War movement, what we saw at the turn of the 21st century when we started that is we had a whole kind of run-up to us sort of reclaiming our civil liberties. So we saw the Iraq War, the Gulf War, we saw the Bosnian War. And then, of course, in '89 we saw the first time Muslims mobilize as a group over the Salman Rushdie affair, which, people have different opinions as to whether that was a valid issue or not, but it was the first time that we had come together as a group and voiced our concern. Now, we've moved from a very kind of sort of insular situation where we were arguing or speaking out only about Muslim issues to suddenly, we've come to September 11th, Stop the War, we fast forward a bit, and the launch of Stop the War from Friends' House, where we had Muslims for the first time on a wider platform. And Dr. Siddiqui was there at the first meeting. There were about 300 people there. And Muslims put up their hands and said, actually, we want to be part of this wider group. And so we formed Just Peace, which acted as predominantly as a mobilizing force. So, our aims are twofold. One, to act as a conduit between the Muslim community and the Stop the War and the greater kind of community. We were sort of infants in a very sort of early steps of learning how to make those connections, how to collaborate, how to realize actually we could collaborate without compromising our faith or our ideals. And an example that springs to mind is the one of at Trafalgar Square, where there were over, I can't remember the numbers now, just if you remember the numbers for that, it's all sort of blur, all those demonstrations. But there were thousands of people, and it was during Ramadan, it was cold, it was freezing, it began to rain. I took the stand and, I said what I needed to, partly because I was a Muslim woman, so very aware that, there was some weight attached to the fact that I was being held up as a poster girl for kind of a liberal Muslim woman. And then, of course, it was time for Maghrib, and we'd organised with people that were die-hard socialists and communists and people of the left who had given no weight or legitimacy to religion all their life, now agreeing for us to have the adhan at Maghrib time. And it was an incredibly moving experience, and lots of people who didn't basically have any religion came up to me later and said, that was amazing, just because it brought a sense of kind of unity and togetherness and a sense of, a a sense of actually this was groundbreaking in terms of this collaboration and this working that we were doing together. So in terms of whether we as Muslims have moved forward, I'd like to say, as young Muslims and as older Muslims, yes, I can definitely see a change. The fact that, as Rashad said, you walk in and there's no brothers on one side, sisters on one side. The fact that a lot of women and men have changed in their personal journey, which has, City Circle has sort of been a platform and kick-started that. And lastly, because I think we're claiming our rights as British citizens, and we're using the whole debate of civil liberties that started post-September 11, a bit before that, as I said. Now we're using our civil liberties to stand up and say, as a British citizen, and I happen to be Muslim, I ask for X, Y, and Z. So I think that, yes, the answer to that is a resounding yes.
Okay. So again, just developing on those points, Manu, do you think, in terms of your experience with the City Circle, in terms of has it provided a space for Muslims to kind of develop their own kind of identity, understanding, their own kind of place, within British society, British context? Has it provided a kind of a bridge to allow communities to kind of plug into the mainstream?
Assalamu alaikum. I wasn't actually given that question beforehand, so I don't actually know how to answer it. Probably beyond my intellectual grade. However, I will say, in terms of the Muslim community or Islam itself, a gentleman called Fahd Mahdi from Q News, who should be here shortly, started this debate of British Muslim identity around about that time. And yes, as Rashad said, it was pre-9/11, pre-7/7, but as Shahida said, the Salman Rushdie affair came up, and this whole issue started to be talked about around that time. Loyalty, you loyal to British, you loyal to Islam, what about freedom of expression, etc., etc. So in that particular respect, City Circle was pioneering at the time without intending to be pioneering, because it was an open platform. And it was a place where people could express their Islam, and from different perspectives. And in retrospect, I'm actually quite surprised how it all worked, because we're quite a disparate bunch, and for the most part, quite disorganized, perhaps apart from Shahida and Asif. And we all, especially me and you, Rashad. And I think we all came together, and we wanted to express ourselves, and people who aren't here today also fitted that mold. And Fahd is just walking in. I was just talking about you, Fahd. So, you are the true son of your father, mashallah. Yes, I'm making an entrance this time. And I think what I would say is that in the current environment, as City Circle develops, don't be afraid to express yourself. If there's something that you want to do, whether it's related to social justice, it's related to charity, related to community, City Circle is a place you can express yourself without being shut down. And I think it's evolved in the sense that in the early days we've had some fractious events, as we were discussing earlier, where things have got a little bit tense. And now it's been accepted that yes, we can talk about those things. So, in that particular respect, I think yes, it's a place for Muslims, it's a place for non-Muslims, it's a place for expression, and it's a place for everyone to be comfortable.
Okay, we want this session to be quite interactive, so if people want to contribute, then please just raise your hand, and then we can kind of get more people's kind of input. Shad, do you have anything to add?
I think the one thing which was quite challenging, and it'd be interesting to get feedback from the audience 15 years on, in terms of how people feel about that challenge and how well or not we've overcome it, was there was a huge, intense internal debate, would be too soft a word, in the early days. Because, we came out of molds, or we inherited, I suppose, a predisposition towards some form of allegiance, or some form of branding, or some form of training towards a particular ideological point in the spectrum. And everybody, no matter how liberal we pretended we were, we had that baggage, and we consciously, decided to try and leave almost theology at the door, which is kind of really ironic. Being a Islamic or Muslim organisation, I never could work out whether we were an Islamic organisation or we happened to be Muslim, because we never defined ourselves in theological terms. We had amazing scholars. We had access to people like Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Sheikh Swad, people like Timothy Winters, some really balanced and philosophical, intellectual geniuses. But we still, as well as people like Abu Muntasir and many other spiritual geniuses, injected a lot of faith into us and gave us a lot of knowledge that we basically didn't have as professionals who hadn't studied Islam. So how was it that we could actually take those theological differences, Shia, Sunni, Wahhabi, Deobandi, etc., and leave them at the door? What was left there? What are we left with? It's just vacuous, empty space to just float around, hold hands, and be merry, And so we were faced with a tremendous attack, I think, from the outside, by a lot of the established brands, for our lack of certainty, for our lack of ideology. You don't learn anything at City Circle. You don't go away with a number of Quran and a number of verses and hadith at the end of the week. What do you go away with? The idea was we actually left one's tarbiyah, or left one's spiritual development to your own choice. So if you were more into the Deobandi background, and you wanted to know your fara'id and your sunnah in terms of how to do wudu, you went to your Deobandi school. If you wanted your Sufi experience and you wanted to basically go down the radical middle way, you went to people like Sheikh Fawaz. But what City Circle really was trying to do, and again, it would be interesting to get the feedback of whether we collectively achieved it, was to take that spiritual flame, or that spark of that connection with Islam, our history, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and channel that flame into action. And by action, not action in terms of jihad and whatever else in the 1990s used to be perceived as Islamic action. But action in the sense that, if you have been blessed, if we have been blessed, and this was, I felt, our defining feature, we've been blessed with a level of education generally, which a lot of certainly my community up north, hadn't had the opportunity of. I felt, therefore, our responsibility in terms of our disciplines, our professions, legal, intellectual, philosophical, medical, ethical, we had a greater duty of care in terms of trying to develop a thought leadership, not theological, not ideological, not in terms of verses and hadiths, or shaping whether or not Allah sits on the throne, literally or not. Those were not debates which I think we've ever had in the history of City Circle. What we were interested in, much more simple, practical things. The interface of Muslims in Britain with the wider community. 7th of July and the ramifications. 9/11 and its ramifications. Civil liberties. The attack on civil liberties, not on the Muslim community, but the attack on civil liberties of the great British legal history and legal system. These were things which, education in minority communities, or the failure of Muslim communities in terms of education, and trying to develop projects to change that. So it would be interesting to also see how to assess how well we achieved that mantra and that fundamental aim, which I felt was our differentiating factor from other Islamic organisations.
One thing just to add to Rashad's point, the one thing that I think we said quite well in the early days is that what we didn't sit together a detailed manifesto or a detailed mission statement, and we literally just made it up as we went along. And I think one of the beauties about doing that, and maybe which has contributed to the fact that, very different people have managed to continue this, and we see the next generation shortly, is because we just didn't get bogged down in that kind of level of arguing about what it is that where does City Circle want to be in 10 years. But that's a conversation we never had in 1999. We just really weren't bothered. We were just bothered about here now, and kind of just getting on. And one of the focuses early on was on our projects. Yeah, so very early on we set up the Saturday school. Yeah, but the idea was just we've got kids out there who are just not getting educated. Just go and do it. Yeah. And one thing just to kind of pick up on Shahida's point is in the early days, and I'm sure it's still now as well, a lot of women got involved. And because City Circle, we had no kind of theology, and obviously we all come from various kind of religious backgrounds, we all had our kind of religious training, but we felt that, we don't have the 50 answers to anything, and a lot of the things we thought wasn't actually applicable, quite frankly, to the 21st century Muslim minority context. So we will instead start using our own brains, and that was considered quite un-Islamic, actually. As Muslims, it's either bid'ah or you're not supposed to, reduce Islam to common sense. I mean, that's why we have, scholars, we outsource our thinking. So we actually in-housed it. Yeah? At City Circle, we in-housed our thinking. And so there were women, for example, there was no discrimination against women, for example. Women were just treated as normal. Which is quite unusual for this relation.
Very pioneering at the time.
Were led by women, and whilst a lot of brothers, in the early days, whilst it might have been a City Circle, which is bogged down in theological, filthy, irrelevant discussions. Yeah.
I mean, there wasn't a City Circle really that in the first 5 or 6 years we couldn't go through without someone heckling at the back, basically saying what we were saying was illegitimate. How could we speak without scholars? How could we have someone that was non-Muslim on the platform? And to constantly hammer home the message, actually, it's an open circle for open minds, was quite innovative at the time. And it's just such a relief, alhamdulillah, to see that today that's not a novelty anymore. And, I think the driving force behind it, just to add, because I think we should go to the audience soon, it was that fact that, it's not because I'm Muslim in it. We were sick of that kind of mentality. And the spirituality, although we left it at the door, was very much at our core. It was left for each of us to interpret as we saw fit. And, as Asim said, we don't have a shape on tap, so just make it up as you go along.
Can I just add one slight nuance to that, leaving spirituality at the door? I think what was also very, very important, certainly from, the early generation, and again, very interesting to hear the next generation, because as I say, most of us are retirees, and we're just taking credit for all the hard work that's been done by the new bunch who you're going to meet in the next few minutes, hopefully. What was really important was, despite having a clear distinction that we are not Islamically trained, we don't claim to be knowledgeable, we don't claim to be competing in terms of hearts and minds for capturing souls, and in fact that's why we didn't have a membership. I think we were quite clear that we all weren't going to give bayah to Munir or Mustafa at the time, or Rabia, who probably was more deserving of bayah than the rest of us. What we did, however, I think we are very conscious of, and again I want to be assessed on this by the audience, is despite our supposed radicalism in terms of not behaving like a normal Islamic thing or organisation, by allowing non-Muslims to sit with us, by allowing men and women to choose where they sit, by having a genuine partnership and admitting that we borrow from non-Islamic sources, because we are dealing with real life issues, by making deep, genuine friendships with people like Madeleine and Gareth and many other organisations who basically, without their guidance, without their support, we would be incredibly vulnerable. We'll be incredibly lonely in terms of navigating, our journey in a very hostile environment over the last 15 years. It's been, we sometimes forget that. But the point I wanted to make is, despite that supposed radical approach, I think we all wanted to maintain a certain level of respect towards sectors of our own community who were at different stages in their own journeys. We want to maintain a certain level of respect towards the more conservative elements of the community, and we didn't want to rip it up and try and invent a new Islam. We all admitted that there's a rich and colourful and diverse cultural, ideological history going back centuries, which different people come from and different people choose. And we wanted to make anybody who walked through that door, whether they're wearing a niqab, whether they're wearing a beard or not, whether wearing a miniskirt or a hijab, or basically somebody who was from a different organisation that we disagreed with, we wanted to make them feel welcome. We wanted them to feel that their intellectual contribution and right to speak up and generate in the mix of ideas which will shape the future of our community was absolutely paramount. And again, I want us to be judged by that. I want us to be judged by also the fact that we hopefully have not disrespected people's ideas, dogma, and established Islamic principles. I know there's been lots of strife recently where attempts have been made to redefine that space. Whether it's the media trying to define pockets or labels of what types of Muslims are acceptable within mainstream British society or not. I think we've hopefully been introspective, self-critical, and harshest within ourselves as a community. But at the same time, it's a place of safety where people can come together and feel, I think your initial word is very important, comfortable, and perhaps